where are you? I wasn't sure if you would be out in California or not. So
No, I am. I wish I am. Let me get set up. I am in New York as of 2012. I was
wow,
in
okay.
LA for about 15 years
Yeah.
and then made the move out east because of my wife. So,
Really?
yeah, I blame her.
Yeah.
Yeah. But no, it's great. I mean, I could do the same thing on both coasts.
Yeah.
So it was easy. And her business was based, family business was based in New York, so it was hard for her to make the transition. So
Yeah.
uh, long distance only worked for about a year before someone's got to close that gap, right? So
Yeah. Did she so how did you meet her then? Was she in LA too? Is that how you met her? Or?
no, I met her at a teammate's wedding, and
Really?
yeah,
Nice.
she was friends with the groom or with the bride, and I was friends with the groom, and we met and did a long distance, and kept it together for a good year
Wow.
and a couple months, and then at that point, you either gotta pull the trigger or not, and so
Mhm.
it was going really well and didn't want
Yeah.
it to end, so made the move, and you know no regrets
Right.
with the relationship, just with the weather and the
Yeah.
coast. But
Yeah.
things
So
are
what do you
changing. So
yeah, what do you do then in New York? Is it
same
similar to
thing.
what you did? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually, I mean, I can do anything, work anywhere now. Post pandemic, everything's remote. But
Yeah.
um, I was working East Coast every summer for a few months on shows. I work in reality television. That's my sort of bread and butter, and so
Mhm.
uh, grew up in that on the West Coast in LA, and then slowly, as I got better and higher on the ladder, was doing the show maybe every summer, starting in like 2008
Mhm.
to about 12. So I had a base here, connections here, had worked here before, knew the landscape. I went to school on the East Coast, so all my friends were living in New York or New Jersey at the time.
Yeah.
So not a hard transition at all, but emotionally and mentally, I was on the West Coast for the rest of my life. So sitting at the
Yeah.
beach and enjoying that life. But
Yeah.
things happen, things change.
Yeah. Do
So
you make it out to the West Coast at all, from
not
time to
as often
time?
as I would like.
Yeah.
Like I said, I'm working for a West Coast based company right now, but I do everything remote, and then our show is based on the road, so I don't even go to LA. I'm mostly in Florida and the southern states. So
Florida's
um,
not bad. Like
no, I mean
alternative.
the humidity and the mosquitoes are of another nature, man. It's
Yeah.
prehistoric down there too. They still got dinosaurs roaming the earth down there, and you never know what you're going to get into. But yes, I'd rather be there than in colder, more uncomfortable places. So
Yeah.
no complaints really. I mean, I
Yeah.
do, but who's
Yeah.
listening?
You called it reality TV. I also read that it's also called non-scripted TV. Is that kind
Yeah,
of the same thing?
non-scripted, unscripted, it's all the same. I mean, it's all scripted in a sense. I mean, you'll see
Yeah.
a non-scripted show and you'll see the credits and it says writers, but depending on if there's a host, there's always writers, but mostly non-scripted formats or reality, it's all in the same umbrella of just non-union and dealing with casts that aren't professionals, right?
Yeah.
So
What led you into that path? I'm curious of, reality TV versus, all the other avenues you could have went.
there's many other avenues I could have went.
Yeah.
It sounds like my mother. The the no, so I went to school for art history
Mhm.
on the East Coast, but I had a love and a passion for entertainment, and I just didn't know anything about it. So I just figured I'd go to LA, where that's where entertainment it lives, right? So I had a teammate from college who was a teacher in Los Angeles, in Venice. He was living in Venice, teaching in South Central, and I crashed on his couch for a couple of weeks, and I was like, this is where I want to be. Right? It was
Right.
the weather was awesome. I had met with a few of my sister's friends who were working in the business, and just kind of pick their brain. And I was like, yeah, this is what I wanted to do. I just didn't know I wanted to do it. And so
Yeah.
when I first got out there, my first job was I was an assistant at a talent agency, and they represented reality producers, but it wasn't reality at the time. It was called unscripted
Mhm.
alternative series and specials. So we did like opening the lost tombs of Egypt and like world's craziest police shootouts and world's craziest police chases and when
Mhm.
animals attack and like Judge Judy and Judge Joe Brown. Like those were like the reality. And then you had the real world and cops and a bunch of talk shows. But for the most part, that was what, and dating shows were just starting to pop up all over, MTV. And those were just kind of what was happening at the time. So I worked for that agent, and then he was pitching shows to ABC, and the networks were starting to get into reality at that time. And so the first shows that were coming out were game shows like Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, uh, The Cube, 21, Weakest
Mhm.
Link. They all kind of spun off because of the success of what Millionaire was doing.
Mhm.
And then that summer of like 2000 or 99 is when Survivor came out, and then Big Brother, and then I was at ABC while we were developing The Mole and Making the Band, and we had a show with Bill Maher. We were in charge of Whose Line Is It Anyway, and then like all of the award shows. So that was kind of our division at that time. And then when it really became reality, I had left to work in development with this guy named Mike Fleiss, and he created The Bachelor. So that was kind of my kickoff into like hands on creating, working in reality television. And that's when it was kind of branded at that point as reality television.
Mhm.
So, and then from there, it just kind of blew up and more shows were coming out, more production companies were, blowing up. And so I wanted to venture out and just experiment in different types of reality television. So
Yeah.
I left The Bachelor and went on to do a couple seasons of Amazing Race, and then Hell's Kitchen, and then uh, Gene Simmons' Family Jewels, Nanny
Mhm.
911, all these things that were just popping up at the time, and then and not trying to get stuck in any one kind of genre. So I was doing a lot of
There you
like
go. Yeah.
random shows where dating shows, cooking shows, housing shows, celebrity shows,
Mhm.
and just kind of learning the different styles and working in different companies and different networks, and then trying to climb the ladder, in the business. So that's kind of
Yeah.
how it started and how it kept going.
And all this stemmed from an art history major.
Yeah, well, it stemmed. It really goes back to when I was a kid. So I used
Mhm.
to do like local theater as a kid in the
Okay.
summers, and
Yeah.
then and I really enjoyed it. But as I got older, I got into sports, and so that really occupied my life, especially in high school. And then that's what got me into college. And then in college, I took as an elective, I think my senior year, I took an acting class, and that really kind of was like, oh, well, this is fun, right?
Mhm.
And at that point, I had already been accepted to Columbia. I was going to coach. I was going to be an art history, hopefully professor. That was my goal. And then after 3 years of college, I was like, I can't be in school anymore. So what else am I going to do? Right. And I had already spent all that time, and all my friends at that point had real like jobs after school. They had gone to all these job fairs and gone through all these rounds of interviews. And I had just taken the GREs and talked to a bunch of coaches. So I had no plan. And my parents were like, you got to have a plan. So it really was just kind of reflecting on what I wanted to do, what I thought might be fun, might be enjoyable, and then go to where like it was king. And so it was entertainment and LA. So that was really kind of the ripcord,
Yeah.
basically.
So you were set on being a history, it sounds like some sort of professor until your junior year, and that's when
Senior year.
senior year.
Yeah, so I was supposed to. It was more about teaching because my dad's a teacher. He's an art teacher and he's a
Hmm.
coach, and so teaching was kind of just sort of what I thought
Yeah.
I was going to do in my blood. Kind of what I do now as a executive producer. I'm more coaching, teaching uh,
Hmm.
producers below me. So that was my goal, ultimate goal, and what I knew. Right, I knew art. My dad's an art teacher, and I knew wrestling. And so
Okay.
if I combine both of those things, but I did it at a collegiate level, then it would sort of work itself out. And
Yeah.
but then when I started to realize like what do I really want to do? What do I enjoy
Yeah.
doing? And if this is something I'm going to do for the rest of my life, is this really what I want to do? And I thought it would be easier to tell my parents that I wasn't going to do it versus starting and then telling them I was dropping out. So
Yeah.
that was the summer of after I graduated college. Like now, now what are you doing? So from like I had a with my buddies, we had a summer trip planned in like
Hmm.
June into July, but from like July and August, that was home that summer after graduation where it's like, okay, now what? Right. And this was in 98. So the internet was like infant, right? I
Hmm.
think monster.com had just come out. So finding a job in LA from Cleveland, Ohio was just, I was going to the library to get on their internet, right? And like, so the best thing my parents did, my mom bought me a ticket to LA or to California, and my brother was at Stanford at the time, just graduated, um, and she was like, "Go visit your brother, figure it out. If it doesn't work, come home." And I grabbed that ticket, and I was like, "I'm not coming home." So, uh, so yeah, I went out there, visited my brother for like a couple of days, grabbed his car, and then drove down and crashed on my buddy's couch, and that was kind of, you know, the beginning of it all.
Wow.
Yeah. I think about it too, and it's completely changed.
Yeah.
Like even our industry has changed. Like since COVID, there have been a couple strikes. There's been a consolidation. There's now
Yeah.
this merger happening between major studios. So, and a lot of our business has gone overseas. Like there's a lot of game shows which you might not even know because if you don't know, you don't know, but that are filmed in Europe, right? And like shows like Rob Lowe hosting some game show that's filmed in like Scotland,
Oh, is that like the
right?
floor? Right?
Yeah, exactly. That's filmed in like Scotland or Ireland, right?
Wow.
Because it's cheaper to have a studio over there and a crew over there where you get a lot of tax incentives and tax breaks from the country, uh, and just fly the contestants over than it is to do it in LA and
Hmm.
have to pay the rental studios in California. So a lot of our industry is going overseas. A lot of it is consolidating because of just the market. So even what I used to preach before of like, you need to get out to LA to get into our
Hmm.
industry, you don't anymore. Like there's a hub in Atlanta. There's a big hub that's building in Cleveland right now.
Wow.
So, and New
Okay.
York obviously has, and Chicago's building. There's a whole Cincinnati, I think, is starting to come up. I think all these cities that are seeing that, if we can bring a production into town, it can, help grow, just tourism, production, jobs, all that kind of stuff. So, and then California hasn't been keeping up with the times as far as like taxes and tax breaks for locals, and so it's gotten out of hand. So it just opened the doors for other countries, other states to step in. So
Yeah. Wow. Um, I wanted to ask real quick here. Um, you know, you work a lot. Like, what exactly do you do on the set? Like, you're throwing out
what
like you're doing a lot. Like
what do
you know,
you do?
yeah.
Uh, so I do a lot of everything, but I probably do more than I should, according to some of my producers, just because I'm like hands on. So like I said, I'm kind of like a coach. So I've done everything.
Mhm.
So on a reality television show or a non-scripted show, you have producers, say The Bachelor, for example, right?
Yeah.
That it's a guy who's dating 25 women. He's going to whittle it down and he's going to propose to one of them at the end. But on those 10 episodes, they go on dates and they
Mhm.
travel, and the dates have a theme, and they're in a location, and something happens, or there's a car or a plane or wardrobe or whatever all that stuff is. So that actual date where he's taking one girl or five girls or 25 girls, some producer came up with that idea. So he's going
Mhm.
to take this girl, and so one example, we had Jesse Palmer, who was
Yep.
the Bachelor, right? Season
Yeah.
5, and he was a football quarterback at that time. He was third string for the New York Giants. And one of the dates that my producing team came up with was, we called it All the Right Moves. And so he went and got this classic, like 57 convertible cherry red and picked up the bachelorette at the bachelor pad and gave her like a Letterman's jacket, and then went to like this park in Pasadena, and it was just this big park with just them on the swing set, talking, and then they went to this ice cream malt shop that's
Hmm.
famous in Pasadena, and they named a shake after Jesse Palmer, and they got to make it behind the counter. And then they drove to the Rose Bowl and pulled on to the center field with the car and tossed the ball around, had a little picnic, and then this marching band came down and played, all around them and blah blah blah, and then
Yeah.
they faded off into the distance, right?
Yeah.
So we had to pitch that idea, we had to find the band, we had to talk to the Coliseum, we had to find an ice cream shop, we had to find a picture car rental place, we had to get a Letterman's jacket made, we had to create all that stuff, schedule it in a day, work with the director, come up with all the interview questions and all that kind of stuff that are going to sort of surround that, so we could easily just sort of work that day when it happened.
Hmm.
um, so all that planning, all that prepping, and then working out deals with vendors, so we get things for free, which we call trade outs. And then on the day of, when that actual date comes, we're the ones that are making it happen. We're advancing to each location and making sure everything's set and prepped and dressed and all those kind of things. And I tell people that it looks simple, like you see a table on a mountaintop and a date happening, but that table did not exist. And so you had to get a table and a tablecloth and knives and forks and glasses. And then what are you putting in the glasses? And where's the food coming from? And how are you keeping it warm? And is the chef on the mountaintop cooking? And then what does that require? All those things that you visually see require someone thinking of it, making it happen, ordering it, delivering it, whatever, it's setting it up, all that kind of stuff. And that's usually what a producer does. And then the other
Gotcha.
stuff that you don't see is the people doing the interviews of these people before, after, during the date, where they're standing there talking to the camera, there's someone next to the camera. That's us as well, behind the camera, asking them, what was it like when he held your hand, and
Yeah.
seeing the sunset on this beautiful mountaintop. All that reaction video comes from us interviewing them, because we're there as well, making things happen, talking to them, encouraging them, doing all that kind of stuff. So all that stuff is really just called producing. But there is also a ladder and a hierarchy in that system. So you start out as like an associate producer, and then a segment producer, and then a field producer, and then a producer, and then a senior producer, a supervising producer, co-executive, executive. So it's all very much like in a rank.
Hmm.
And so as you get to the top, you kind of oversee more and more of the project. You also lean over into the post production of it as well, where you're working with the editors, you're working with story producers, who are sort of the post side of what a producer is doing in the field. They're the ones that are now sort of, well, I relate it to cooking, right? So like,
Hmm.
this, you create stuff, right? So this podcast right now is more like we're creating the groceries, we're making the content, but the
Hmm.
editing part of it is more like the kitchen, like where you're slicing and dicing and
Yeah.
cooking it and making that final product that you're going to send out to the world, cutting out whatever you know rough edges are there. um, that's post production, and so that involves an editor and then a story editor who is sort of helping craft that story with the editor. And then you usually have, the editor has like an assistant editor who's kind of like grouping and slicing things, kind of like a sous chef, into smaller, more prepared bites and bits. Um, so as once you get to those higher ranks of supervising, co-ep, executive producers, that's where you have to start overseeing both sides of it. So very much like a head coach, right? There's the technique in the room where you're drilling and overseeing the assistant coaches and the team. But then there's also the logistics side, where you're dealing with the administration and the scheduling and the travel and the parents and all that kind of stuff. So that's eventually where I ended up getting to be basically a head coach, but in something that I enjoy doing much more, I think, than I would if I would have stayed in art history. So,
Yeah.
uh, and that was kind of the goal, is like finding something I really enjoy doing and then just trying to be as best as I can in it by just doing it as much as I can, learning as much as I can, and then eventually, hopefully, helping others get better at what they're doing because I've been there before. So
So
yeah.
how many people did you recruit to help you with Clash of Dynasties then?
Wow.
Because is this like your own that is this like your own fully production?
Yeah. So
Okay.
this is so even with um, Foxcatcher, Team Foxcatcher, we came on after they had already kind of left the station, right? They were
Mhm.
filming a little bit, they had raised a little bit of money. Nancy Schultz was involved, John Greenhall, the director, was already editing and shooting some stuff, but they just didn't have full direction and didn't have enough money, and they needed sort of that fundraising,
Mhm.
investors, but then also just helping sort of get through the whole process, and that's where we came in as our first film. And then when we did Angle, but then after, once we got to a certain point with Team Foxcatcher, we were able to sell it to Netflix, and then they came on with a full like
There you go.
caboose of infrastructure and production and all, helping us finish the film. And then with Angle, we had already partnered. They had a company called Campfire had reached out to us to help them do their film, and that involved again financing, but also they had no idea about amateur wrestling, so we had all the connections to like coaches and wrestlers and friends of Kurt, who would participate in, give us archival footage and stuff like that from Team Foxcatcher as well for that film. But yeah, for Clash of Dynasties, it was all from scratch, and it was very much set up in the sense of what I had done in the reality unscripted world of just putting together a production. I hired a lot of the same people that I've worked with before in reality to be my director of photography, my cinematographers, my audio, my editor, um, but using all of my knowledge from just producing uh, to actually make and do the interviews. And it all started from a podcast during the pandemic, is really where it all stemmed from. And that's how I learned a lot about the stories from the Walsh side, but also knowing the full story over that 10-year period, where I felt that it was a strong enough story to tell. Versus just like a old, high school glory days kind of thing. You think
Mhm.
back of, oh, I remember it was great back in high school, but this really was great back in high school, and to a fact that like I wasn't even involved in 90% of it. And so I looked at it as an outside observer. And then when I heard more and more of these stories and started digging into it, that's when I was like, I could tell this. But I also realized, based on the podcast, that I was really the only person that had this experience that can tell it. And if someone else was
Mhm.
going to do it, I'd be upset if they told it wrong. So
Mhm.
that's where the recruitment came in, is that I couldn't do it by myself. And because it wasn't my story, it was collectively our story. I needed the guys from Walsh to be involved as much
Right.
as I was involved,
Mhm.
because I knew that I would need 50% of their side of the story.
Mhm.
Um, and there was already a documentary being put out by Rudis, was doing a small sort of independent film that they were doing a lot of experimenting with some of their content creating, called Men of Iron, because of the Iron Man tournament that Bill had created.
Mhm.
And it really told Walsh's side of the story, about how, Bill had created this band of, bad boys to take down the giant of St. Ed's and how they had done it. But it really just told their side of the story. And it was about 35 minutes long, and probably had like maybe 5 or 10 cast members, and a selective amount of archival. So when that was coming out, I was talking with them, because they're all Ohio guys, um, and realizing that they were just going to tell one side of the story. So my
Mhm.
job was to tell the both sides of the story, and then try to get as many people as I could from both sides involved, and really tell it from their side. And so that was sort of the impetus behind everything. And then it was figuring out how to tell a 10-year story in, enough time where you could, tell it and enjoy it, but also not drag it out too long where it just became like too insider and, wasn't paced well enough. So
Mhm.
that, I think, was the biggest challenge. And then all the archival footage. right?
Where'd
Just
you find that? That was one of the big questions I had was like, I mean, this was the 90s. And like you said, the internet wasn't a thing really until like the 98, 2000, Y2K type thing,
yeah.
So, like, where'd you get
No,
all that
we were
stuff?
lucky enough. So that was the other thing too, is that I wouldn't have taken it on if I couldn't paint the picture or cook the meal, right? I needed ingredients, and the more ingredients you have, the more footage you have, the better you can, tell a story. Um, and so we were lucky enough that one of the guys involved in commentating our sort of rivalry, our state tournament, our district tournament, was this guy, Brian Brakeman. So he's in our film as sort of the announcer, the voice.
Mhm.
He was a historian in the fact that, like, in the late 60s, early 70s, he started broadcasting on public broadcast in Northeast Ohio, wrestling, high school wrestling
Wow.
tournaments. And he and this guy, Mike Massa, his co host, they would do, obviously, when St. Ed started getting big, they would do all of St. Ed's super quads where they would invite teams from around the country. They would broadcast that. They would broadcast the district tournament, the state tournament, and then two holiday tournaments. And so, because St. Ed's was always good, and in the finals,
Mhm.
they had a lot of high quality, and he was shooting it in high quality. Sometimes he shot it in 70
Yeah.
millimeter, right? And so, they had all of this footage, and the guy who's the curator of it is a guy that went to Walsh, and so he was on the wrestling team as well. This guy named Greg Bizjack, and he works for the public broadcast in Northeast Ohio. So I reached out to him. He had access to it. He gave me complete access to that. And then it became, and I knew that we were always in the newspapers. We were always in amateur wrestling news. We were always in USA Wrestling. So the articles existed. It was just finding those. So it was like reaching out to those, outlets to see what their archives were. And they were both, open to sending me a bunch of their stuff. And then it was all the personal footage, which was probably the hardest stuff to find, just
Mhm.
because 30 years ago. But what was
Mhm.
great is that, yes, it was the 90s, but that was when camcorders were just becoming super popular and getting smaller. And as the years went on, they got smaller. I can tell because the tapes that I got, like in the ones from the early 80s, are these fat VHS, sometimes beta, tapes. And then as the 90s get on, they're smaller and smaller. And now they, require an adapter, to work in a VHS.
Mhm.
Um, so that was the big thing. And, finding stuff from people who, their parents had a flood, or they moved nine
Yeah.
times, or it's in my grandparents' house, or, we had a fire, or, oh, we just threw all that stuff out because it was 30 years old and it was me from high school. So who
Yeah.
cares? So that was a lot of the stuff we ran into. But we still had an overload of just, footage that, I mean, there's so much that we just haven't, that's what our social media
Wow.
is doing right now, is just kind of throwing things up there that people haven't seen yet because there's so much of it.
Yeah, I think what really caught my the first thing I'll say is the one thing that really I thought was done well was it actually left me wanting a little more, which is I think where you kind of want to end it, is you want them to be like, wow, I want to know more, because that's where I was. I also didn't realize that the story is more than just wrestling too. There was a lot of adversity that went on there, on both sides, um, that really captured my attention too. And I was like, wow, like there was way more to the story than just two schools that were really good at wrestling that were just competing against each other. There was just, so I think that's the other really compelling story that I found about Clash of Dynasties was just, that it was more than just wrestling and what they actually went through off the mat too, as
Yeah, I
team.
think our biggest and that was another reason that we decided to take, because all of our wrestling stories have to have another story. It can't just be about the sport,
Yeah.
and it can't just be. And I think that was my biggest concern was, yes, these teams were great during the 90s, but it can't just be about these teams being great, right?
Right.
What did they overcome? And as I started to hear more of these personal stories, then I was like, okay, people think that this is a story about two great teams winning and just
Mhm.
dominating during the 90s. But this is a bigger story about loss, and how do you
Right.
deal with loss, and not just losing, the national championship or losing in a dual meet, for the first time in 14 years, but how do you deal with death And the more I started to hear these stories, and I didn't even think about it, and we didn't even show it. Like there, I think were two more deaths that we went through that we didn't even talk about in the film, just because
Wow.
they didn't happen during the season, so it didn't really affect us during the season, but it happened during the summer before. Like one of these guys, my teammate, my year, Gusiak and Terrace was he was in a car accident. He was like directing traffic on a bridge as a summer job in Cleveland and got hit by a car, right? But it happened during the summer and it didn't have any effect on by that point on our dual meet or team lineup or anything like that. But
Yeah.
we had gone my senior year, we had already gone through like five deaths, like five funerals
Uh,
between coaches, teammates, alumni. um, and I didn't really think anything of it. And when I got to college and I was talking with my roommate who was also a wrestler, I was mentioning like he's mentioning how he had to go to a funeral for like his grandmother or some older person. And I was like, dude, I've been to five funerals already for people under the age of like 20, right?
Yeah.
And he was surprised. But I was like, oh yeah, I guess it is kind of strange. And when I started digging back into these interviews and talking to the coaches and to the wrestlers, it hit hard for a lot of
Yeah.
them that yeah, we did go through some stuff, and you just had to keep going, right? And I was just looking at one of the coaches' interviews, and we used to have the initials for every person that had passed, like on our sleeve. And at one point, we had I think four people's initials. So we had eight initials like on our sleeve, and it looked like an alphabet, right? It didn't even make
Right.
sense anymore. And that
Yeah.
one, and our Coach Heffernan, was like, "We got to stop. Like we're just reminded of death," and he took them all off the next season. But yeah, that I think was the biggest thing, and I think it all started too with Bill's story, Bill Barger's story in Vietnam, right?
Hmm.
And just wasn't necessarily loss, but
Hmm.
his pledge to God was something that like I had never heard that story before, right?
Right.
And then for it to come true, right? Like anyone can say, like, please God, I'll stop smoking, cigarettes if you just do this, or I'll never have
Yeah.
another drink again if blah blah blah, right? But no one, no one sticks up to it. No one, does it. You just get through whatever the hardship is, and then you're right back to where you were. But this
Hmm.
guy prayed for his life, got his life saved, and then went and saved a whole bunch of other people's lives.
Yeah.
So I think that's where it all like the beginning of that. Hearing that story was where I was like, okay, well, this even starts. And I had no idea that he was even military, right? And then
Right.
our Coach Urbis, was also a Marine. So we were both being led by two ex veterans. So that was what I found also interesting too, but they led in completely different ways.
Yeah.
One was like a rebel and one was very like militaristic. So it was, but they accomplished the same goal in two different ways, So I'm glad that you recognize that there was a
Yeah.
lot more that happened off the mat and
Yeah.
on the mat.
Yeah. I mean, the big one was when the ref passed
Yeah,
away. I mean,
exactly.
that was
Right.
what are the my thing was like, what are the odds that it's between these two teams that have already experienced loss on both ends? Like, I don't know. I found that just like one in a billion.
And I forgot about that story. I remember it briefly because I had called home to talk to my dad to see who won the match. And then he was like, oh, it didn't happen. The referee died. And I was like, I think I was shocked at the time, but wasn't there, didn't experience it, didn't read
Yeah.
any news articles about it at the time. So it wasn't really like imprinted like, oh my God, this was a major thing. But then when I started hearing the stories about it, I was like you said, like, what are the odds between the two top teams in the country that this happens mid match and then actually brings them closer together because
Right.
they shared this experience? It wasn't one team's, parents that we weren't really close to. It wasn't another team's coach that, they weren't really close to. So it didn't have like an effect on, the individual teams. This had an effect on both teams. Right.
Yeah.
And, you know, uh, and we just did a podcast of our own with one of a guy who wasn't there. He was much younger, Dominic Abinator from St. Ed's, who wrestled at
Michigan.
Michigan, right?
Yeah.
His aunt and uncle were best friends with the referee, and he had stopped over at their house to visit the husband, but he had already left for work, so he had some coffee with the aunt, and he was complaining about having a headache and not feeling good. and that was the day of the match. So he went to the match knowing, feeling something was wrong.
Yeah.
Um,
Wow.
but yeah. So again, you had something happening on one side, happening on another, and then something happening right in the middle that drew these teams close together. And then again, having the archival of that,
Yeah.
having footage and articles of that to just reinforce it. Um, it was one of those things. That's why I think I was like drawn to, okay, I've got to tell this story. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, and I was thinking back to like when I was wrestling in high school, you get to like you see these refs quite often.
Oh
You know,
yeah.
they kind of appear at the same tournaments. You just sort of come across them.
Yeah,
And
you if you watch the footage too, you'll see him in other matches. He in the match the season the season before where Walsh crushed St. Edge. He's the
Mhm.
ref in that match. He's a ref in our district tournament. Everyone knew him.
Right. Yeah.
He was a Cleveland police detective, so everyone knew him because
Wow.
he always had a gun out, right? And when he would come into, the coaches would tell the story about how he would come into the coach's locker room at St. Ed's, before a match, and he would always take his gun out and put it in the locker. And sometimes that was like the first time that these guys had seen a gun before, right? And so they'd be like, "Oh my god, this guy's got a gun down in the locker." Uh, but he was the coolest dude. He had this cool, mustache.
Mhm.
And there were like two or three referees in Northeast Ohio who were solid, always hired, and I think he was hired for those matches because both coaches trusted him. And oh, the other thing was usually that those dual meets there were two referees. He was the only referee on that night. So I don't know if the other referee had called in sick
Mhm.
or it was just they figured he could just do it alone. But I think the buildup of the stress too, right? Of just that dual meet and calling it, I think added to everything that was going to happen. So
Sure. Yeah. I should have prefaced by saying there's going to be spoilers in here. So if you haven't watched it, you might want to turn off and go watch Clash of Dynasties. Was there stuff along the way, like stories along the way that hit hard for you and made it almost relive some of those moments that were either difficult or exciting, or I'm sure there were times where either maybe you even forgot about it and you're like, oh my gosh, yeah, that's right. Wow.
yeah, I think it hit hard, sort of re-talking about some of the deaths
Yeah.
that we had gone through and just piling them up over and over again, and then kind of putting yourself back in those moments. I took out footage of me sort of breaking down because it didn't necessarily make sense because it was the year or two before I kind of
Mhm.
entered the scene, as a starter. So it didn't make sense for me to kind of pop in. I did, as you'll see, like I would bring in the new guys for each year, intro them, and then the guys that sort of graduated sort of faded out and then didn't come back in until sort of the end. So it didn't make sense for me to just throw myself in there. And I tried to keep myself out as much as possible until I needed to be in there. But uh, reliving the deaths and just the number of them, and what that was like to sort of go through. And then there was also just the way that the 90s were. Like if you look at those dual meets too, they were packed to the gills, and those
Yeah.
children just like on the mat, like kids, like high school kids being thrown into the crowd
Mhm.
in on top of children, and the children just getting right back into the same spot, and no adult caring whatsoever. They don't allow that anymore, right?
Yeah.
But that's what made those dual meets so much fun, is because people were just right on top, and it was suffocating. And then seeing the faces in the crowd of those young kids who became wrestlers later
Mhm.
on, uh, you know, you could just see them mature 4 or 5 years later, and now they were actually on the videos in those matches. So I thought that was really entertaining. And then some of the stories that we left out. There was one story in Reno, this first year of Reno Tournament of Champions. They invited St. Ed's and Walsh, and St. Ed's and Walsh went out there, but there was a snowstorm in Ohio. So I think Walsh barely got out, and St. Ed's got split up in like two or three different like planes, and none of the planes were gonna get in until like 3 hours before the tournament started. So all the planes landed, and they had to go straight in
Mhm.
basically the tournament, but on one of the planes, and they were communicating by plane phone back at the day, right? And on one of the planes, uh, Coach Urbis called the tournament and was like, "Listen, man, we're not going to make it until like hour before we're supposed to step on the mat and wrestle. Our guys are on weight. You got to let us eat, right? We can't weigh in. Like, let us skip weigh-ins." And I think he said there was like a Parkersburg coach, like a Midwest City, Oklahoma coach, and Coach Barger from Walsh. And I think the Parkersburg was like, fine, they don't have to weigh in. I think Midwest City was like, nope, they got to be here. They got to weigh in. And Barger stood up and was like, I don't trust you. I don't trust you. I don't even trust myself. But if Coach Urbis says that they're on weight, they're on weight. They don't have to weigh in. And they didn't have
Wow.
to weigh in. And coach was like, I hung up, told the plane, everyone cheered. I started eating, ordering from like the plane service. But just a story like that too, where I had heard about it from one person, but hearing from multiple people, then from multiple angles, but then also hearing the capper that uh, Barger was the one that wanted St. Ed's at the Reno Tournament of Champions because he didn't feel that it would be the best tournament if they weren't there, right?
Yeah.
Not to be like, yeah, we don't want them here, because there's competition. He wanted them there. So I thought that just those stories along the way of camaraderie through competition, right? Like the
Mm.
fact that Ferguson gave the playbook to Barger to even
Yeah.
kick off that thing. Like he wasn't afraid of it. He was, and it echoed through the coaches like Urbis and Heffernan and even Barger, where it's like, listen, if someone's going to challenge you, like don't back down, don't run from them, like welcome it. And then if they beat you, get better,
Hmm.
and that's the only way you're going to get better. And I also think too that maybe Ferguson didn't realize that Barger was going to do it. He was like, "Oh, this guy's not going to do it, right? You know how hard it
Yeah.
is to do
Yeah.
what we're doing, right? He's not going to do it." But he did it, right? And
Yeah.
so that was just another sort of knock on the nail of that, that like there's a good story here, right? There's
Hmm.
this guy that, and I also learned that Bill was a twin, and his older, well, not older, but his older twin brother was just a better athlete than him, and so he
Hmm.
kind of grew up kind of this underdog, always wanted to be good at something, but knew that he wasn't good as his brother. Um, Loved the sport of wrestling, but didn't excel at it, right? But he was going to use that to help save children, and I see that echo today in Beat the Streets,
Yep.
and that whole organization and foundation of how they're saving lives through the sport of wrestling. So I feel a lot of these stories echo, through today. Uh, and it's just interesting to hear them also from another side and the full completion, because sometimes you'd hear a story from some other source, or not even a real source. It was just a rumor mill because we didn't have
Hmm.
the internet at the time. So, and it
Yeah.
wasn't real. It wasn't true. But now you hear it from them and you're like, oh, well, that makes 100% more sense. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, I thought there was a lot of pertinent stories.
Yeah, for sure. And like you said, there's even a lot that probably you left out. And that's what makes a great story or a great show is when you have more footage than necessary. You know, it also makes it probably kind of hard to pick and choose, what gets left out and what gets put in. So,
Yeah, and I think too, like I've seen a lot of wrestling documentaries, and sometimes I feel that that's in wrestling stories, and I feel that that's sometimes the downfall is like you're trying to squeeze everything in, right? And
mhm.
sometimes less is more,
Yeah,
and making sure that everything has a purpose, right? Like I
right.
said, going back to cooking, like the ingredients, like you just throw everything in a pot, there might be something that tastes good, but it's going to be overwhelmed with all this other stuff, and sometimes peeling back some of those ingredients and just making sure that they're really good ingredients, will sort of fit and make do.
Mhm.
So some of those stories just it like Blair, there's a whole section that we have on just Blair Academy that we didn't get into because as we've started peeling back the layers, it wasn't about Blair. It was
Right.
about St. Ed's versus Walsh. And yes, Blair stepped in and disrupted for a year, and then obviously towards the end for the whole run. But they were just sort of the new Walsh when it came down to it. We weren't going to go off and go down a whole nother rabbit hole of what that could be a whole nother docu series.
Yeah.
But yeah, so there was a lot left on the floor. Um, but yeah, you're right. I think, not telling everything and not trying to force everything ended up making it a little bit better.
Are you kind of hinting at there might be more of these stories
I
in
would
your
love for there to be more. I
in
mean,
your,
we
in your
trademarked
future?
this. Yeah, we trademarked the series Clash of Dynasties because we know that there are more stories like this. I mean, there's college stories, right? There's Ohio State, Michigan. There's Yankees, Red Sox. There's Lakers, Celtics. There's a lot of. I mean, there's tons of, and it doesn't have to be a team dynasty. It could be an individual person. It could be an obscure sport like curling, But there are those stories out there where, there is a David versus Goliath, and Goliath is taken down, but what are the other stories too? Where's the struggle? It can't just be about two teams that are great and one takes the other one down. Where's the fight in the stands? Where's the death? At the state tournament. Where is the heart attack? As one team is just dominating. So that's what we're hoping and plan to do is what
Wow.
is that next story? Because we know that there's a ton of like there's the Wyoming seminaries and the Bishop McCourts and those kind of teams that are going at it now, the Faith Christians. But what is it other than just two awesome athletes? What is the
Right.
struggle? You know,
Yeah. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on Vision Quest then. All right. The
the
best wrestling movie ever made, people love it. It's nostalgic. And like I watch it and I'm like, this movie, like, yes, it's awesome. It was, it's a great wrestling, but it kind of sucks. Like I might
well,
get hate for that. Like, but I still like the movie, but like I'm watching, I'm like, dude, this is kind of
no, I mean, it is for what it is and what it was. It's been the calling card for wrestling for
right.
30, 40 years now. So it's the grandfather of all wrestling films.
Mhm.
But I was just talking with someone the other day about how these new wrestling films that are coming out are at least taking the sport more seriously,
Right. Yeah.
and demonstrating wrestling more realistically. Like Foxcatcher, the story's a little off and they
Mhm.
squeeze a couple of different storylines in different timelines, but the wrestling itself is way more realistic. And Unstoppable, same thing. Even like Win-Win, or what's another one that came out, the one with Chris Pratt. Anyway, uh the I enjoy that more because they're using wrestlers as
Mhm.
stunt coordinators, stunt people. They're staying a little bit more true. They're
Yeah.
still using the high percentage moves like lateral drops and fireman's carries to the back. Uh, but yes, the Vision Quest way over dramatized. I heard they're potentially making a remake of the film.
A remake.
Yeah, uh, with modern stars, probably some MMA folks, and obviously college and Olympic wrestlers.
Yeah.
But yes, the '80s style of dramatic storytelling, and I enjoy it just because it
Yeah.
it is a time capsule
Mhm.
of what parenting used to be like, what wrestling used to look like in a sense from like the layperson's eyes,
Mhm.
of just like the guy warming up by himself in the back, comes out dramatically, throws a lateral drop, pins his guy, team lifts him on his shoulders,
Yeah.
runs out the champion. So to answer your question, I love it. I love the fact that they're making better ones, more realistic ones, and I think they should continue. And then same thing, with documentaries. Just continue that storytelling, continue to get it better at documentary storytelling, so we can grow the sport and bring in more fans. Right?
Yeah. How cool or unique or whatever verb you want to use was it, to get all these guys together and sort of tell the story from their perspective of what they experienced. I know it's been 30 years and all, but it's still like, I mean, you probably looked up to some of these guys. You probably haven't seen some of these guys in 30 years, or you never met them, but you knew who they were. I mean, how cool was that? Um,
I thought it was amazing, and
yeah,
it was funny because I spent 2 weeks in Ohio. I spent 1 week at St. Ed's and then 1 week at Walsh with my crew filming, and it felt like a time capsule. It felt like
yeah,
going like when we were shooting B-roll of the school, like walking the halls
yeah.
alone with like the school closed during the summer and getting up on the going into places like the roof that I never knew existed when I went to school there. And now I've got
Mhm,
access to these places and I'm filming in classrooms that I studied in 30 years later. And I haven't spent a lot of time at that school since then.
mhm,
So going back was very nostalgic. But then talking to these people and then interviewing them, especially in St. Ed's wrestling room, it again, you're in that room it was summertime and there's no AC in that wrestling room, so it was hot as can be. So it felt like the heat was back on.
mhm,
And then talking to people who were I was part of the story, I had observed the story, and then I had heard about the story, right?
mhm.
So like you said, even in St. Ed's, there were people that I had never really talked to before.
Right.
I'd met everyone. Hadn't talked to everyone in detail about any of this stuff, especially the younger guys. And then at Walsh, it was almost 100%. Like I had never spoken to these guys about any of this stuff. Maybe through two or three. The guys that I called, like Clint Musser, Jamie Grottle, and Scott Overholt, all my age ish were the first people I reached out to because I kind of knew them from just being on the Ohio junior team.
Mhm,
And then it whittled down to like Frank Favaro, me, Musser, and Brent Thompson as sort of the producers that were helping sort of put all this together. But yeah, 100% surreal in setting. Uh, I think my crew and I were listening to like 90s music at the time too, cruising through the old neighborhood of like setting myself back like I was arriving at school and at practice. And then, interviewing coaches, teammates in the same place that all this stuff took place. And then crossing over to what quote unquote the enemy lines, right? So I'd never really being in their wrestling room, only being in their gym once for a dual meet, and not really stepping foot on their campus. So that was another thing too, is like I had to overcome that, not uncomfortability, but unfamiliarity. And then
yeah.
also they didn't know me, right? They had heard or had watched some of the things that we had done, but they didn't know me, and they knew that I was a St. Ed's guy, right? And they maybe knew my dad, but some of them were apprehensive, like, who is this guy? What story is he going to tell?
Good
You
point.
know,
Interesting.
is it going to be one sided? So they were breaking down those barriers too, and really just getting them to tell their side of the story as honestly as they could.
That is a talent that I have learned over the years of doing this that doesn't come easy, but it's a learned skill, to get people to open up when maybe talk about things they don't really want to talk about. I mean, like those losses you talked about, even death, like some people don't want to relive that, and so I think it just shows a testament to your ability to get people to feel comfortable and in the 2 hours that you sit down and talk to him to be like, okay, I trust this guy. I can open up a little bit, more than I thought I could. So, did you sense that a little bit as you were getting them to kind of talk like, wow, this is a good
Yeah.
story.
Well, I think just from all the interviews that I've done for just reality shows, especially when you're getting them to talk about personal stuff on
Yeah.
camera, and you know you have to make them comfortable, right? And you
Yeah.
can't start right out the bat with those hard hitters, right? You got to save those. I usually save those for the end, because if they start going down an emotional path, and you've still got other stuff to ask them about, trying to regather them or regroup them mid interview is sometimes impossible.
Yeah.
And then just comes out of left field. And so reacts can, you've got to build up or steer in the direction things are going. Because once you go down that path and it starts going that way, you got to stay in that lane. So uh, with the Walsh guys, especially like the St. Ed's guys, we had gone through a lot of those deaths together. Even though I
Right.
wasn't starting varsity, I was still part of the team, and so we had gone to the funerals together. I'd known that environment, but when talking with the Walsh guys, especially about their parents passing, and then how they dealt with that, that took a certain timing, emotional security between conversation, and then also knowing that, I'm not gonna make this come off as any way that's not the way that you
Yeah.
want it to be portrayed, right? And then same thing with the fight in the crowd, right? When it came down to talking to the wrestlers whose parents it was, just being respectful to that whole situation, because again, I had heard from our side what was going on, but when you hear their side, you're like, oh, okay, well, this is different. So yeah, I think it. And then what I did do was I did play, because three of the producers of the film out of the four of us were from Walsh, so I screened it for them in as we were building each segment, each series. I would give them the cuts to look at to make sure that I was in the right direction and I wasn't overstepping bounds or, don't mention that, take that out, whatever. Just so we
Hmm.
were all, again, it wasn't my story to tell. It was our story for me to help tell, basically.
Hmm. I think also just hearing about all this stuff, taking into consideration everything that we've talked about here so far, did you feel a sense of pressure too as you were filming this and as you were going to release this and put it together? Like I would just me personally, I would feel immense like second guessing, and I would late nights, and even after I'd release it, I'd be like, man, I would just be a nervous wreck, thinking, hoping that I got it right, you know.
Yeah. I mean, I since we started this thing, I've had sleepless nights. Um, I think the overall thing was we had these premieres that so I wanted to have a screening for all the guys involved,
Hmm.
just to get their blessing, but I wasn't gonna do much changing for the mass environment of the people involved, right? The producers that were attached, I would take their word and their notes, but
Yeah.
I needed to show it to about 50 guys to just, I wanted them to see it before anyone else saw it because it was their story, our story, but there were some emotions involved. And so I wanted
Yeah.
them to be aware of what everyone was seeing before. But I didn't want to do it in pieces and I didn't want to do it without me being there to see their reaction. So we decided to put on these two premieres for the four episodes. So we aired the first episode 1 and 2 in Akron, and invited everyone and anyone. And that was a big turnout. And then the next day, we did episodes 3 and 4 in Cleveland at the House of Blues. And it was more of the St. Ed's crowd. But both of them were sort of premieres slash screenings for the guys and their families and anyone who sort of wanted to take part, see it before it was released. Um, and the response was great, and huge turnout. Everyone who was involved showed up and came from wherever they were living, which is all across the country. And the reaction to it was exactly sort of what I wanted. As soon as I pressed play, I kind of stood in the back of the theater and just did they laugh at the right parts? Did they cry at the right parts? Did they emote? But yes, nervous wreck. And then when we released it, nervous wreck. We're still trying to build back all of our investors, still a nervous wreck. And then being a part of it, right? I'm usually behind the camera.
Yeah.
So I
I was
wasn't
wondering about
fond.
that.
Yeah. So I wasn't fond of being in, I'm still not fond of being in front of the camera, but I got to get used to it because I've got to help promote, tell our story. And I realized as the stories were being told, where I fit into that story and how important I was in sort of that pivotal year of, is it going in one direction or is it going in the other, right? And realizing how close it came. Um, so I figured that I had to be part of it reluctantly. Um, so yeah, that was interesting. It's still interesting. I think that there's still, like you said, more to tell, and we still hope to do that with our socials and our podcast, and all the things that come out from that. So yeah.
Yeah, that is interesting that you brought up being in front of the camera because I was wondering, what it was like to be in front of the camera as opposed to behind it. And and I don't want to say purposely because I don't think you purposely did it, but if you left yourself out more than just because you didn't want to be in front of
Yes,
the
that was purpose. That was purposeful.
camera.
I did not want to be in front of the camera unless I absolutely needed to be. And it was more reactionary. And I think mine was probably more sort of plot line story filling
Yeah,
of what's setting the tone of what's happening and what needs to be happening and driving the story forward than it was necessarily like giving my opinion on things and weighting the story on one side or the other. There are things done super consciously to avoid that. But yeah, that was, and then I, with the help of one of the producers, Frank Favaro, I had interviewed myself basically, right? Because I knew what I wanted to say, I knew the questions I needed to ask after asking all these people.
huh.
So that was also weird too, of just like staring at someone and just talking and talking
Mhm.
and just kind of knowing. I just needed someone to keep my eye line, so it wasn't directly down the barrel of the camera.
Yeah, and you said St. Ed's, the second premiere, if you will, was episodes 3 and 4, and a lot of St. Ed's people were there. They probably weren't too happy because episodes 3 and 4 were more so about Walsh sort of dominating and maybe a little bit at the end there in episode 4 where St. Ed's kind of came back on top. So I'm wondering if they were a little not
I
upset, but
I
like,
think well, episode 2 ends with Walsh, finally, taking over. And so that
Mhm.
was the celebration, I think, in Akron was, hey, you know, we took down the giant, at the
Yeah,
end of episode 2. And I think in episode 3 and 4, I think the celebration in Cleveland was, hey, we got it back. We're
yeah,
back to where we were, they're gone now. So all is right in the world again. So that was sort of, everything always has a purpose behind it, right? And
Mhm.
I knew that the just whose story it is in it starts off as David versus Goliath, but then Goliath and David kind of switch roles.
Mhm.
And then it goes back to sort of David versus Goliath. But then there's a new David on the scene at the end that could be a whole nother series, but with Blair.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was we tried to make it balanced in both ways, right?
Yeah. You want to talk about purpose, real quick. I wonder if the reaction to this has, you know, shown you why the purpose of why you do these things. Did you get just this overflowing reaction of thank you for like I kind of forgot about these stories or wow, what a great time it was. Like, thank you for telling this story. And did it give you a renewed purpose or did it give you emotional? Like, I'm sure all the above, but
Yeah, I think all the above. And I don't really think when you're in it, right, you're just in the battle. You're
yeah.
just going through the trenches, you're just digging and you're trying to finish something. You're just at that point, you're just like, I just want to get through with this thing, get me out of here, get it done. But once you see people's reactions who haven't seen it, who have no idea what's been going on, but are part of it and have shared their story, you do realize the impact that it's had on them that again maybe you weren't so keen to because you're just in it and
Yeah, for
buried.
sure.
And I didn't realize too how personal it was for a lot of these guys and how you know wound revealing and wound healing that it was for some of these guys to talk about. Some of the haven't mentioned the death of their parents since then or even talked about it. Now it's out in the open, for other people to hear and, comment on. And then other people talking about losses that still haunt them today. My brother is part of that, and it was also interesting, interviewing my brother and my father for the series. But my brother was one of those examples of someone who didn't have a good experience. He looks back on it not fondly, but with regret. because he didn't accomplish the things that he wanted to do. So, I did realize as I started to receive some of those compliments and some of those just personal conversations before and after the premieres, that how personal it was to some of these people, how seriously they took it, how respectful that they were to me for showing gratitude and appreciation for being able to tell the story and telling it the way I did. Um, and then I think also what I really thought was cool was the younger generation of these wrestlers that were in high school who showed up to these premieres or we screened it for them later, having heard these stories as like folklore, right? Of these ancient people like me, doing these things, but only hearing about it from the coaches retelling these things, but then actually seeing it and hearing from these people and seeing archival footage of these matches, of news articles, I think they were really like, oh my God, that really did happen. Like we've only heard about it. So in our mind, yeah, sure, it happened, but we didn't, some of it just seemed so out of, uh, uh, pocket that it didn't seem real. But now
Mhm.
actually seeing it and then seeing footage of it, you're like, oh my God, that did happen. So I think that was probably one of the cooler responses was from the younger generation of,
Mhm.
and just seeing that these stories are just still out there. They're being repeated all the time, right? There's always going to
Mhm.
be some person that's number one that someone's always after them, and how do they figure out the code to take them down? Penn State's number one right now. Who's taking them down? Right?
Right.
People are trying.
Yeah. Yeah. The I bet the thing is though, whoever's going to take Penn State down, they're probably not going to be roughly in the same city. That was another really appealing thing. Like there's so many appealing things that we could keep talking on, but yeah, another one is, they were what, 10 minutes apart or so.
No, it was a little further. It was like 30
Well,
miles,
yeah.
but 30 miles in the state of Ohio is like 30
Right,
minutes,
right.
right? So it was, I mean, you saw them. That was the thing is at one point, not when I was there, a few years later, like in 2000 or in 96, 97, they were seeing each other 7 times a season in all the tournaments, all the dual meets, that they were number one and two just going at it every other
Yeah.
weekend. That's like Alabama and Ohio State just playing each other every other weekend in football.
Yeah.
So that I think because of the proximity of how close they were in Northeast Ohio, and they were sometimes pulling from the same pool of talent. Like there were
Yeah,
many
of course.
people that I found out later that they're like, yeah, I was going to go to St. Ed's, but I ended up going to Walsh, or I was closer to Walsh, but I just better for me that I went to St. Ed's. So it was just, the talent that came out in the 90s. And again, that's just two high schools. There were so
Right.
many guys from the North Akron Wrestling Club that didn't go to Walsh, that went to other schools in the Akron area that had they gone to Walsh, it would have been just a monster. But
Mhm.
just the talent that was coming out of just Northeast Ohio at that time and spreading all across the country, I think was the biggest, eye opener too. At the end, it wasn't just like, oh, these guys are great in high school, right? These guys
Yeah.
went on to win national titles and be all Americans and set streak records and all that kind of stuff. So, yeah,
Yeah, the proximity was, yeah, the other thing that I mean, sometimes, you have proximity where they're one and two in the state. Okay.
right.
All right. But one and two in the nation. Gosh. So was there anything that stood out to you that you found out along the way that really opened your eyes to, or reopened your eyes maybe to how special this was? Like, you lived it and you knew it was special and you knew the story was going to be great, but were there things along the way that really reimagined the way you thought of this
Yeah,
era and like how it was?
yeah, and I don't like the question I kept asking everyone is, do you think this will ever happen again? Right. And could it ever happen again? Could Walsh get back to its dominance, and could St. Ed's, still be there? And could they be ranked number one and two in the country, and go at it back and forth? And it was a resounding no, maybe some maybes, but the platform of wrestling has changed completely, right? You've got two Catholic schools, religious schools that, quote unquote recruit because they can pull from surrounding other Catholic schools, grade schools. So you don't have to be in the public school. They can pull from public schools as well. Um, and so that's how you can usually strengthen a team like that. But with the Blair Academies, the Wyoming Seminaries, the Highland Preps, like these are now boarding schools. So you're
Yeah.
getting people from other countries, other states, right, that want to go and compete with these teams that are now number one, two, three in the country. So I don't necessarily think that you can get that again, because of the format has elevated and changed. Now it's like a college format. And plus
Hmm.
with NIL, right? There's NIL allowed in high school in state of Pennsylvania, in state of Ohio now voted it last summer.
Wow.
So these kids can make money. And where is that going to go? Right? Can a public school now who has a wealthy donor pay kids to come and compete or stay in the area, and create a dynasty that way? So do I see that was, I think, probably one of those things that I learned along the way is like, this might have been a once in a lifetime thing, right? Yes, you might get Wyoming Seminary versus Blair Academy, and they're in the same state. They're not too far away, right,
Hmm.
from each other. But what they're not from maybe the same, the kids aren't from the same state, right?
Hmm.
So I just don't think it'll be the same.
Yeah.
And again, like you said, that close together. But we always hope,
Right.
because what I learned along the way too is that rivalries, there is a formula to dynasties in a sense. If you look at all the great dynasties, there's always been consistency in the coaching or consistency in like the management. They've always had like star athletes and then just a cycle of like the feeder system that continues to keep replenishing. Um, so I learned that, and that all great dynasties have similar DNA to each other, no matter what
Mhm.
sport they're in. Um, but can it happen again in that area? I don't know. Do people want it to happen again? Yeah, of course. Rivalries help, drive, just the sport in general. And I think that was, I think, happening with in football, between Philadelphia and Kansas City until this past season. People like to see, those two go at it, and we're rooting for the good guy versus the bad guy.
Mhm.
So would love to see it, but I don't think it'll happen again. Another reason we had to capture, that time capsule and put it out there.
Yeah. Did you, I also, like I grew up in wrestling, my whole life, but I was kind of more isolated to Iowa. So it was really cool and eye-opening to me to also see that, like, now that I'm older, I know this, but there's wrestling elsewhere, and there's great wrestling elsewhere. And like this was such a huge deal. And I grew up, I was born in 92, so this was right when I was still growing up, obviously. But to go back in time and to see and hear these stories about, the 90s at Walsh Jesuit and St. Ed's, it was really cool from even an outsider perspective to see these stories. Did you get a lot of feedback from people who maybe weren't in the area and didn't know about it and were like, wow, I didn't even realize it, or they knew maybe just a little bit of the story?
Yeah, I think that's what we're experiencing now is the growth of just the story and how it's expanding into a wider area, because that's
Yeah.
really what our mission was, is that yes, it's a small, state of Ohio, Northeast Ohio story, but it echoes way further across the nation, just from the people that came from these two schools and then went on and participated in, college wrestling all across the country and excelled, and won national titles, became Olympians.
Yeah.
So that was, I think, a big part of, again, wanting to tell this story, is that it wasn't just limited to the state of Ohio or to these two high schools, that it was a broader, more national story, but that even if you didn't go to these high schools, you still heard of these high schools. You still knew someone or wrestled someone or saw their name of someone from these high schools in these large competitions all across the, like from juniors and cadets and, you know, all off into the NCAA tournaments. But I think that the stories also echo, because there's always a dynasty or a number one team in every state, in the country. And there's always a number two school that's trying to knock them off. So you've got that rivalry, that good guy versus bad guy. Always, even when I talk to other people, they're like, "Yeah, that's like the Cannon McMillan, Erie Prep of Pennsylvania. They were always back and forth. Um, but it's also the stories of, like you said, you went to Iowa. These two teams were based basically on Iowa, right? St.
Yeah.
Ed's, positioned themselves and wore the same color uniforms as Iowa, and then Walsh was copying St. Ed's that was
Mhm.
copying Iowa, so they were basically copying Iowa. But that was also a time capsule of the '90s, right? Iowa was the '80s and '90s of wrestling, and that
Mhm.
style of wrestling, and then also just the hard hitting style of just the '90s. Like you could get in a fist fight and they'd still let you wrestle, right? They'd
Yeah.
give you a penalty point, but they'd still let the match continue, and let it go, So uh, I think that those were, I think the fun things to hear people talk about is because fights are still happening in the stands.
Mhm.
Parents are still getting into arguments with other parents, and it's making flow wrestling. So times haven't changed; they just have, right?
Yeah.
It's just more of the same.
Yeah. I think I'd be remiss if I didn't also mention the fact that I felt, and maybe this is done purposely on how you portrayed it, there was a respect between the two. Sometimes when you get one team trying to knock off another team, it gets really um, it can get spicy, for lack of a better word. And it just didn't quite seem, there were moments, like you said, the parents fighting in the stands, that like there were moments a little bit. That's just kind of the heat of the battle. But it just really felt like there was a respect between the two, that like they were going to go out there, fight like dogs, and then may the best team win, and they were going to accept the result. And whatever that was, they shake the hand and they say, "Good job." I don't know. That was my portrayal of it, and I thought that was pretty pretty cool. I guess you could say.
Yeah, I think there were waves of that, right? I think when it started, St. Ed's didn't really think much of Walsh because they weren't really anything. And
Yeah.
Walsh hated St. Ed's because they
Yeah.
were, the king of everything. And they had to have that hatred, to in order to accomplish what they accomplished. And then when that happened, I think St. Ed's all of a sudden was like, whoa, these guys are legit, So there was a like a respect from like, oh, you beat us up, so you got to be good,
Mhm.
right? And then they did it again, and then they're like, oh, well, okay, you guys are legit. And then after they started doing it more and more, this younger generation, I think, was seeing their older brothers get beat up by this new giant, and so now they had the feeling and opinion of hatred that Walsh had. It's for St. Ed. So this younger generation of St. Ed's guys that came in, like the Bertines and the Mark Janes and the Mason Leonards, those guys came in with this hatred that Walsh had at the beginning of their run. So there was like but at the very end of it, and I think St. Ed's needed that in order to take them down and take over again. But at the
Mhm.
end of it, at the end, they all kind of had a mutual respect, like you said, where it was like
Yeah.
going to battle together and going. And again, they were the only two teams that were doing. Yes, there were other teams that were involved in a lot of the top 10 teams in the country at that time, but these were the only two that were, right in each other's backyard, going at it
Yeah.
all the time. They were on the same teams, in the summertime. So there was moments of, hey, we have to play together and work together, at juniors and at cadets. But for the rest of the time, you're my enemy. So 30 years later, when you look back and you're like, holy cow, we were really good and you guys were really good. And,
Mhm.
respect, right? For doing what you did, and then the mutual respect is there because they're like, well, yeah, you guys went back and took it over. Um, so yeah, like you said, there would be hatred there. And I think there was. I think it was in
Mhm.
waves though. I think it started with hatred from one side, you know, disregard for the other, then mutual respect in the middle, and then the hatred and disregard flipped, and then at the very end, I think it was again mutual respect for what we both went through.
Yeah, there was hatred, but it didn't to me ever cross the line into disrespect. And so I thought that was the beautiful thing about the rivalry there,
Yeah, and I think that
um,
goes to the coaches too, like of just
for sure.
they're the leaders of the men, right? So it's like, yes, we've been to war, we can go to battle, but at the end of the day, respect your enemy for he stepped on the same, mat that you did, you know.
Yeah. Did you sense that at all? Like when you sat down with maybe some of the Walsh guys, that there was a slight sense of like, he went to St. Ed's. Ugh. I got to
Oh yeah,
overcome that barrier of like,
yeah. Oh, some of them even said it too, right off the bat. Like when I first met them, because some of the guys I didn't know, the older
yeah,
guys especially, right, they didn't know me because I hadn't accomplished anything by the time they had graduated. So,
yeah,
they knew of me obviously from doing research or hearing the podcasts that were leading up to that. But other than that, I was a stranger. So yeah, they
yeah,
were giving me a little guff of like, who are you? What are you going to say? This is you're in our house right now,
yeah,
so pay respect.
yeah. And you just mentioned Ryan Bertine. See, I have a slight hatred for Ryan Bertine, you know. So obviously, yeah, I work with the Air Force wrestling team, and my office mate is Joe Johnston,
Oh, there you go.
and Ryan Bertine beat Joe Johnston in the
Yeah,
NCAA finals.
yeah. Uh,
I don't like the guy.
he's a great guy. His
Yeah.
story is great too because like yes, he was obviously an NCAA champion, but he came in to a school that was rebuilding with Yoshi Nakamura and with Gray Maynard and Mike Kozicki, and they had the hammers on that team already. So he didn't really blossom until his junior senior year. So he was kind of a late bloomer, but then he just took off.
Mhm.
He peaked at the right time of his career. Uh, but yeah, I could. People hate the enemy, right?
Yeah. Did you find that a lot in the story of like both sides, guys taking their lumps as freshmen and sophomores before really finding their groove as a junior or senior because they've been through kind of the battle for a year or two now, and that just kind of how it was with St. Ed's because you were so good and so deep.
Yes, that's exactly the way it was because we had so. I mean, I also figured that out too. Is that these kids from the North Akron Wrestling Club, they started at a very young age and they all started together, and
Mhm.
they were getting high level competition at a young age from crossing state lines, going into Pennsylvania, going into West Virginia, going into um, New Jersey, and competing against really great kids from that time. Whereas the guys that were feeding into St. Ed's were coming from the CYO of Northeast Ohio, which is the Catholic Youth Organization, which was very robust. But we were all spread out and we were coming from different Catholic schools. So with the North Akron Wrestling Club, that was something that Bill Barger created, where those
Yeah.
kids were coming there and then going straight into Walsh, where we were coming from different Catholic school teams and then going to St. Ed's. But like my brother and myself, some of us, we didn't start wrestling until like seventh or eighth grade. And we enjoyed it. And so because we were Catholic schools, we just fed into the big Catholic school, which was St. Ed's. Like I didn't want to wrestle at St. Ed's. I tried out for the swim team, my freshman year, and I was terrible at it. Swimming was the hardest sport I've ever tried. And then when I got into wrestling, I got injured my freshman year, so I only wrestled like 9 matches. But with the system at St. Ed's, and because there were so many wrestlers and such high level talent, there were like 60 wrestlers in the room at that time, and 4 teams that you got to go through the system. Kind of like what I was talking with my job, right? I didn't know anything about the entertainment industry when I moved out to
Mhm.
LA, but I got into a really good sort of system of the companies I was working for. And there was a particular ladder to get to the top, to get to be a starter. I just had to grind it out and learn along the way because I didn't have a long pedigree of wrestling, growing up in grade school. The one thing that saved us, my brother, me, Yoshi, was judo. That was we took that, I think, in starting in like when we were 7 and took it until we started wrestling, which was like 13. So we had a good 6 years under our belt of just throwing, tripping, all that kind of stuff at a competitive level, you know. So wasn't that big of a stretch.
Yeah. Then what's next for you? Do you have something that you're working on in the pipeline, or are you just back to your day-to-day, operations are you an executive producer? Is
Yeah,
that
so I'm an
okay?
executive producer. I work in reality television, unscripted shows right now.
Yeah,
So I
yeah.
do a bunch of shows for HGTV. So I do like in the house hunting sort of
Mhm.
format. So We have a show called Life's a Beach that is just like people looking at beach houses that I'm doing this summer. And so that gets me down in Florida, the Panhandle, all along the eastern, western coasts with home buyers. I'm working on a show in Singapore with a couple comedians who are traveling the world, taking part in weird, strange customs uh, in development, and then doing our monthly podcasts and our social media promotions for Clash Dynasties. So constantly just creating, making content,
Mhm.
doing as much as I can in the wrestling world, and hopefully enjoy some summer. So
Hopefully,
yeah,
hopefully that gets sprinkled in there.
exactly. I got a few weeks home every few weeks from being off the road, so that's when I try to squeeze that in.
Mhm.
But it's going to be a hot summer, so hopefully, we'll get some waves and some pool action in there.
Yeah. Where can people find Clash of Dynasties? And I'll link it in the show notes and everything. And when I do social media, I'll make sure to post it out there. But just for the listener.
Yeah, I mean, you can find everything at our website, clashofdynasties.com, or find us on social media at Clash of Dynasties. We've got our YouTube site, we've got our social medias up, and you can find us on Clash of Dynasties is on Apple TV, it's on Amazon, iTunes, Google Play, YouTube. You can, rent, buy, own it, and check it out. All 4 episodes. Great story, and like we were talking about today, hopefully people will find that it's more than just the state of Ohio. It's more than just these two high schools. It's really a great just wrestling story and a story about loss and overcoming loss.
Yeah, resilience for sure. And also one team being on top, falling, getting back up and getting back on top.
Yeah, that was a bigger theme too. I think is and one of the people mentioned in the film is it's about getting knocked down and getting back up again. And how do you deal with adversity, and how wrestling will help us through all that stuff, right? Like getting through death and overcoming personal loss. If you're a wrestler and you've gone through the grind, it can be a lot easier sometimes than if you haven't. So
Yeah. Um, And the last thing I'll say is they were knocked down a few times, like St. Ed's was on top and they got knocked down. They were like, all right, I'm getting back up. And Walsh was like, no, not yet. And so like they took a few lumps along the way and then they got back up. So like even though you want to get back up and get back on top immediately, it's not always on your timeline.
yeah, that
So,
big thing too. Like Coach Ferguson always used to say is just don't quit, right? Don't
right.
quit. You never know when something's going to happen, or you never know when the other person's going to quit, right? And it could just be right before you're about to, but you end up quitting. You never know, right? So
Hmm.
that's the one thing. Consistency is king, and just don't give up, right? Don't ever
Yeah.
quit.